Exercise set 1-2. Outlining arguments in premise and conclusion form. From A Workbook for Arguments by Morrow and Weston. The objective of this set is to give you practice rewriting arguments in a clear and logical structure. The instructions for this set begin with us going through the sample exercises and all of the odd-numbered exercises from exercise set 1.2. After I present each example, pause the video. First, identify the premises and conclusion from the argument. Then, put the premises in a natural, meaningful order and write them out in a numbered list. Write the conclusion at the end of the number list using whichever style you'd like. After each example, I'll give an explanation. For your graded assignment, you'll complete all of the even-numbered exercises from exercise set 1.2. Here's the sample. Some companies are creating genetically modified animals, such as salmon, that provide more meat for consumers. If genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild, they'd compete with natural salmon for food. Natural salmon, though, have been honed by natural selection to flourish in the wild. The genetically modified salmon are not designed to flourish in the wild. Thus, non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon if genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild. So, here's the answer argument for the sample. Premise 1. If genetically modified animals escaped into the wild, they would compete with natural salmon for food. Natural salmon have been honed by natural selection to flourish in the wild. Genetically modified salmon are not designed to flourish in the wild. So, non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon if genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild. Now let's look at the explanation for this. This argument already presented its ideas in a clear and natural order. The only thing that we needed to do was put it into premise and conclusion form by identifying the premises and then putting them in a numbered list. The first sentence in the passage isn't a premise in the argument. Its purpose is to provide context and not to give a reason that supports the conclusion. Because of this, we didn't need to include it in our outline of the argument. Okay, now we'll move on to the odd-numbered exercises. Exercise 1. Although he's only halfway through his basketball career, LeBron James will eventually surpass Michael Jordan in MVP awards, All-Star appearances, total points scored, and many other records. It's quite possible that he'll win as many championships as Jordan did. So far, Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time, so LeBron will eventually become the greatest player of all time. Okay, so pause the video, and first identify which sentences are the premises and what is the conclusion, and then put them in premise-conclusion form. Here's the answer. Premise 1. LeBron James will eventually surpass Michael Jordan in MVP awards, All-Star appearances, total points scored, and many other records. It's quite possible that James will even win as many championships as Jordan did. Premise 3. So far, Jordan is the greatest basketball player ever. And finally, our conclusion. So, LeBron James will eventually become the greatest basketball player ever. Now, how does this compare to the numbered list that you came up with? Let's look at our explanation. The word therefore is a conclusion indicator. It's one way to see that the conclusion of this argument is that James will eventually become the greatest basketball player of all time. All of the other sentences in this passage make sense as reasons for that conclusion, so you should include each of them as a premise in the argument. Notice that this premise and conclusion outline of the argument doesn't merely copy the entire sentence verbatim from the passage. It changes the sentences slightly so that each sentence can stand on its own. And this is an important part of the process of putting arguments in premise and conclusion form. All right, let's move on to the next one. 3. A team of researchers, led by Brendan Nahan at Dartmouth, wanted to study the effects of giving parents information on the safety of vaccines. They gave some parents information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, stating that there's no evidence that vaccines cause autism. Other parents received no information about vaccine safety. When compared to parents who received no information, parents who received information were no more likely to vaccinate their children. Nahan and his colleagues concluded that simply providing information about vaccine safety does not increase the proportion of parents who get their children vaccinated. Okay, so first, identify what the premises are and what the conclusion is from this passage, and then put them in a numbered order. Here's the answer. Premise 1. A team of researchers, led by Brendan Nahan of Dartmouth, gave some parents information from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, stating that there's no evidence that vaccines cause autism. The team gave other parents no information about the vaccine safety. When compared to parents who received no information, parents who received the information were no more likely to vaccinate their children. So, simply providing information about vaccine safety does not increase the proportion of parents who get their children vaccinated. How does this compare to your numbered list? Let's look at the explanation. This exercise gives a simple example of scientific reasoning. Accounts of scientific reasoning are often presented as stories about what a group of scientists has done, but you can usually reconstruct the scientist's reasoning from the story. In this case, the story starts with the explanation of the scientist's hypothesis, that is, the idea that they're trying to test. They wanted to test the idea that giving parents information about vaccine safety would increase the proportion of parents who vaccinate their children. Here's a little more explanation. Notice that the reasons given for this conclusion don't just consist of observations the researchers collected. The researchers didn't experiment. They gave information only to some parents, and then they compared the behavior of those parents to the behavior of parents who didn't receive that information. Scientific reasoning often works this way. You start with a hypothesis, and then you do an experiment to generate exactly the kinds of observations you need to test the hypothesis. And then you reason from your observations to a conclusion. All right, let's look at the next example. 5. In 1908, something flattened 800 square miles of forest in a part of Siberia called Tunguska. Theories about the Tunguska event. Some people say it was a UFO. Some even say it was a teeny black hole. Recently, however, scientists discovered that a lake in the area has the shape of an impact crater that would have been created by an asteroid or comet. So the Tunguska event was caused by an asteroid or comet. Now let's look at the answer. In 1908, something flattened 800 square miles of forest in a part of Siberia called Tunguska. Scientists discovered that a lake in the area had the shape of an impact crater that would have been created by an asteroid or comet. So, the Tunguska event was caused by an asteroid or comet. Let's look at the explanation for this. The fact that there are other popular theories about what caused the Tunguska event might make us more skeptical about the conclusion of this argument, and in fact it probably should. Since they're not reasons for a conclusion, though, we don't include them when outlining this argument in premise and conclusion form. Note that, like the previous exercise, This argument illustrates the scientific method in action. Since there are numerous competing hypotheses about the cause of the Tunguska event, scientists try to find ways to test those different hypotheses. Developing and testing multiple hypotheses is an important part of doing good science. Drawing conclusions from these tests requires careful reasoning. Okay, let's move on to the next example. 7. All cars should have a spear mounted on the steering wheel, aimed directly at the driver's chest. After all, we should do everything we can to encourage cautious driving. Since people behave much more cautiously when they know that their life is on the line, steering wheel mounted spears would make people drive much more cautiously. Okay, let's look at the answer to question 7. People behave much more cautiously when they know their life is on the line. So, people would drive more cautiously if there were a spear mounted on the steering wheel of every car. We should do everything we can to encourage cautious driving. So, all cars should have a spear mounted on the steering wheel, aimed directly at the driver's chest. Okay, let's look at an explanation for this one. This one is quite a bit different than the others that we've looked at. This argument contains a sub-argument. That's an argument within an argument. Premise 1 is a reason for premise 2, and premise 2 is a reason for the main conclusion. So, we call premise 2 a sub-conclusion. We include that 2 follows from 1 by writing so after the 2. So is what we use to identify the conclusion, and we can see that conclusions can happen in the process of an argument. Just because this argument seems ridiculous doesn't mean that we can't put it in premise-conclusion form. Putting an argument in premise and conclusion form is a different task from figuring out whether it's a good argument or not. Alright, let's move on to the last one. It's possible for someone to wonder whether her life is meaningful, even if she knows that she has enjoyed her life. This shows that a meaningful life is not the same as an enjoyable life. At the same time, someone who is alienated from her life or feels like her life is pointless, even if she's doing things that might seem worthwhile from an objective perspective, is not leading a meaningful life. This shows that a meaningful life is not the same as a life spent on objectively worthless projects. All of this shows that neither enjoyment nor objectively worthwhile projects, considered separately from the other, are sufficient for a meaningful life. Okay, this one, like the previous one, is pretty complicated. Let's look at the answer. It's possible for someone to wonder whether her life is meaningful even if she knows that she enjoyed her life. So, a meaningful life is not the same as an enjoyable life. Notice that premise 2 is a sub-conclusion following from premise 1. 3. Someone who is alienated from her life or feels like her life is pointless, even if she is doing things that might seem worthwhile from an objective perspective, is not leading a meaningful life. Another sub-conclusion. 4. So a meaningful life is not the same as a life spent on objectively worthwhile projects. And these premises together lead to the final conclusion. So neither enjoyment nor objectively worthwhile projects, each considered separately from the other, are sufficient for a meaningful life. Like the argument in exercise 7 of this set, this argument contains sub-arguments. Premise 1 is a reason for premise 2, and premise 3 is a reason for premise 4. Premise 2 and 4 taken together are reasons for the main conclusion, 5. Now these last couple examples may seem complicated and overwhelming. Just do your best. It's going to be okay.